get a start going here. Thank you all for coming. There's more seats down the front if anybody's struggling away up there. And first of all, Auntie Bridget Chili Davis is going to welcome us all to her lands here.
Thank you, Helen. Hi everybody, how are you? My name's Auntie Bridget. These are my traditional ancestral homelands here. This is my grandmother's grandmother country. I identify as a Malula Kabi woman. So we've got the Kabi Nation, Gubbi Nation, and we're a sub-clan group which is the Malula. So our tribal boundaries run from the Maroochy River, Cooke Creek, up to the headwaters of the Malula and out to sea country, and that footprint. So on behalf of my ancestors, my old people, I'd like to welcome you all here to country. I'd like to see you all come out to country and we'll do a traditional welcome to country. That's a smoking ceremony, but you never know, you might have a day excursion out there on country one day. So anyway, welcome everybody.
Thank you very much. There's a lost soul out the back there, Maggie, trying to find the table. And there's seats down the front when you catch her. Hi everybody, I'm Helen Cooke, and I'm going to bore you all terrifically because it occurs to me that not everybody knows much about archaeology. So I'm going to be the first one here. It's like Archaeology 1, we could run a test at the end if you like. But because in archaeology you never see the full picture of the past, you see bits. So I'm only going to do bits too. So if you want to find out more, there are ways to do it. And thank you all for coming. It's lovely to see so many and to see these bright young faces here. And I would like to thank and welcome all the other Indigenous people in the audience who've come from far away and near, and it's lovely to see you here. Please make yourselves known to the students at morning tea and lunchtime. There'll be plenty of time to mingle, talk to each other, don't be shy. And at lunchtime we'll have some show and tell stuff, so that'll be even more exciting perhaps. Right, so I'm going to run you through Australian archaeology as a bit of a background to what you'll be hearing next, and I'm going to teach you, so it might all go astray, who knows. So I acknowledge the owners of the land we meet on, as Auntie Bridget has charmingly welcomed us. I feel better now. We respect the wisdom of the elders, past and present. And I also acknowledge the contribution of the Ngunnawal people of Canberra, the many traditional owners in South Australia, and the Watine people of Weipa, who've helped me to begin to understand a little of their cultures. So I'll just zip through this to show you perhaps the links to ancient history and Australian archaeology, and also the social issues in Indigenous matters. So I know they come up in the school curriculum. So archaeologists are a bit like detectives of the past. Their pictures really don't have much to do with what I'm saying. It gives you something to look at, doesn't it? We study culture through things, material evidence left behind by people when they were living, eating, discarding, making artefacts. That's tools, implements, containers, and these sites in the landscape where they used to do these things. And we try to work out where, what, when, why, how they did all this stuff. So, yeah, my colleague over there gets dirtier than anybody else I've ever seen. So. He's Irish, does that probably explain? He's not used to the heat. We study at university for at least 3 years to get our ordinary degrees, another year for honours, and then masters or PhDs. But after the ordinary degree, you can begin working as a consultant archaeologist, and there's a few of us in the room here, so touch us for luck, I think is the word. Archaeology is the technical side of interpreting history, which is complementary to the cultural and spiritual information that traditional owners might share. It's especially useful where there's no recorded history, but it can also reveal more of the real story, the background behind history, and combined with the study of government reports, historical archives, settlers' diaries, letters, early records of Aboriginal culture as seen by archaeologists. We like to think we put the people back into history, and when you do archaeology, you often find the domestic scene, the women and the children, and you find what they were doing while the men were rushing around doing whatever's important and has been captured by historians. So there are many scientific methods of analysis. Archaeology began in the 17th and 18th century more as a treasure hunt by European antiquarians, historians and geologists. They were curious about Greek, Egyptian and Roman ruins. So many fine examples of ancient cultures were taken back to European countries until the owners of that heritage brought in laws to stop the thefts in the 20th century and stop the graffiti. The great Belzoni was also a circus strongman, but became one of the earliest archaeologists in Egypt. Couldn't resist leaving his name there. But images up the top, like that vandal, gives archaeology a bad name. That is not what we do. I love the theme song. You know, they're ripping yarns in the movies, but it's a cultural disaster. In the 19th century, European scholars misconstrued Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, thought that people evolved technologies up a scale of cultural levels, from hunting and gathering to farming and industrialisation. When European archaeologists excavated sites, they classified artefacts, the things made by people, into types and called those found together assemblages. I called them collections because they're no longer in the order in which they were excavated, but that's what they are. The study of geology showed that layers of rocks and soil build up over time, and the same stratigraphy applies to campsites and towns built up by humans. And relative dates were assigned to the excavated layers. The changes in these assemblages through time were described as cultures, dividing history into old, middle, new, stone age, copper, bronze, whatever. But there was never a connection made between the people living in those countries today and what was left behind in the past, which seems so obvious to us in Australia, but wasn't what they thought of there. And Australia's had a long association with archaeology. The first excavation into earth mounds was organised by Governor Phillip up there in the corner in 1788. He saw a midden, which was the dirt and shells left on the side of the beach, and he said, dig in and let's find what's in it. And yeah, they found stone tools. Well, yeah, that's what the Aboriginal people had left it there, and that's what they found. So the science of archaeology began when some researchers brought in systematic excavation, instead of just getting a shovel out and digging a big pit, and good recording methods. And one of the first was the English grandson of your namesake here. His name is, he's the grandson of Captain Matthew Flinders, the one who told whitefellas that Pumpstone was a passage, not a river. Aboriginal people knew. But Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie up there began to preserve even the little bits he excavated in Egypt, and catalogued everything and saved them. And he was the first one to do that. He has a link with us, doesn't he? Now, studying artefacts can tell a lot about when these were used, whether the raw materials were local or imported, and what they were used for. But once an artefact is taken from its original site, a lot of this contextual information is lost. That's why archaeologists work so carefully, recording every step of the way, taking photos and including scales. And now the Aussies here, so Grafton Elliott Smith, who was from Grafton, became a professor of anatomy at Cairo in 1900 and furthered his interest in archaeology. He was the first person to X-ray mummies. There's a first for us. One of his students, Raymond Dart, was born in Toowong, far away, became a professor of anatomy in South Africa. And he leaned into archaeology when he was asked to classify a fossil skull, and he called it a new hominid, a pre-human species, Australopithecus africanus, southern ape, in 1925. And his studies of the Australopithecines and the stone tools and bone tools that he found associated with them opened the study of the processes of fossilisation, which is called taphonomy, and also many debates on human ancestors, which continue. Gordon Child, socialist and pacifist from Sydney, living in the UK, wrote books in a non-academic language for the first time, for the general reader, and showed archaeology as part of what happened in history, published in 1942. Norman Tyndale, born in Perth in 1900, began working as an entomologist, studying insects at the South Australian Museum. And he became interested in Aboriginal culture during his stay in Groote Eylandt, where he was helping the mission to set up there and also collect insect specimens. And being museum director said, well, while you're up there, get some Aboriginal artefacts for us. So that's what he did, and he met the people there. He learned that Aboriginal group members could move safely in their own country, but it was dangerous to go beyond those boundaries unless you were authorised. His editors wouldn't allow him to publish the evidence of territories, as it conflicted with the colonial myth of Aboriginal people as aimless nomads. But he was a real all-rounder. Tinny studied geology, geography, anthropology and linguistics, and learned from Aboriginal people whose knowledge of all biological species was crucial to their survival. He photographed and measured people and recorded in detail the culture, kinship, language, traditions, rock art and artefacts of many Aboriginal groups across Australia, assembling a very large archive of notes, film and sound recordings. Today these anthropological studies might be considered a bit invasive. They actually collected samples of hair from the Aboriginal people. They asked them if they could do it, but whether the people at that stage had a lot of idea what was going to happen to it, who would know. But today today his records have supported an Aboriginal family history project at the South Australian Museum and enabled many to find out about their Indigenous ancestors. And they're using the hair samples now for DNA testing, so with permission nowadays of people who know exactly what's being done with it. And the State Library in Queensland actually has Tyndale's records that relate to this state. So they're there for anybody to use. Generally, white Australians thought that Aboriginal people had only been in this country for a few thousand years. Tyndale used sea level changes to date cultural stratigraphy for the first time in Australia at an archaeological excavation in 1929 at Devon Downs, North on the Murray River. He confirmed that Aboriginal people had lived here for many thousands of years, adapting their lifestyles in response to environmental change. Tyndale's precise records allow his work to be reanalysed, and he had the foresight to preserve some samples which can now be dated scientifically and give absolute dates to his work. He published his first map of Australian tribal boundaries in 1940, revised it in 1973 to publish with the book Aboriginal Tribes of Australia, Their Terrain, Environmental Controls, Distribution, Limits and Proper Names, a compendium of data dealing with the known Aboriginal groups in Australia. The term tribes become a bit controversial and some of the details have been queried, but the magnitude of this work showed once and for all to everybody that Australia was not terra nullius. That was all the hundreds and hundreds of Aboriginal people who owned, or looked after and were owners of parts of the country. Stone artefacts discarded by Aboriginal people are the most plentiful evidence of past lives, as they last longer than other cultural remnants, and they were used all over Australia from the earliest times into recorded history. Frederick McCarthy came from Sydney, worked at the Australian Museum. He started with birds and reptiles. Tyndale started with insects. Then he studied anthropology and published a book classifying and describing Aboriginal stone implements, which helped people who were describing sites on different sides of the country. So we're all talking about the same thing, mostly. He excavated many sites, he recorded rock art, and sadly he helped to send ancestral remains to the USA, but I will update you on this issue later in the presentation. In the 1920s, 1930s, archaeologists proved to the disbelievers that Aboriginal Australians used a range of sophisticated techniques to make stone artefacts, shelters and art, develop hunting and fishing technologies. You want to speak yet?
No.
Aboriginal people used hammer stones to make flake tools from local glassy materials like silkcrete and quartz that fracture into nice sharp blades and pieces, and they honed their skills to make precision tools like blades, and they discarded the waste or clean-up pieces in the cores left after the flakes were struck. So all of these will tell you something about the process of making the artefacts and possibly what they were used for. Special stone resources were traded with their neighbours, but just for daily use they'd often strike a nice sharp blade off whatever was to hand. Hard volcanic stones like basalt were first flaked and then ground with wet sandstone to form an edge like that nice hafted axe up there. And axes like that had handles, hafted we call it, and the large sandstone slabs were used as grindstones for seed and small ones for ochre, which is a pigment to put to do body art and wall art, whatever else you need your pigment for. All the pieces of worked and uncommon stone that have been carried to a campsite are recorded and weighed, measured, and the evidence of manufacture and use recorded and analysed. That's the boring, long part of archaeology, but that tells you a lot of information about what went on in the past. They can tell us about the raw materials, and I've already told you about them in the context. Okay, Professor John Mulvaney used his returned serviceman opportunities to study history in Melbourne, but he had to go to Britain to study archaeology as there wasn't anywhere to learn in the 1950s here. He returned to begin archaeological research and teach in Australian archaeology. He was sure that it was just as ancient and interesting as the classical studies. In the 1960s, John helped to excavate and study the ancestral remains of Mungo Lady, the oldest cremation found in the world. At this time, Aboriginal custodians were keeping a low profile to avoid racism and the taking of their children, and no governments, developers, planners or researchers thought to track them down and include or consult with them in any projects. In 1969, an archaeologist who'd been actually arrested while he was supporting Aboriginal land rights protests tried to find and talk to traditional owners in the Darling Basin, but couldn't find anybody and they wouldn't talk to him. In 1989, the Parkinji, Muti Muti and Nyampa traditional owners of the Willandra Lakes area imposed an embargo on research, which stimulated a seminar at Lake Mungo and culminated in the return of the remains of Mungo Lady in 1992. John brought the antiquity and sophistication of Aboriginal Australian culture to a wide audience by publishing the first general book on Australian archaeology. It was called The Prehistory of Australia, a term we don't use much because people find it offensive. It simply means there was no written history at the time. It's been revised, I can recommend it to you. It's written in quite good language, easy to understand. There's a lot in it. He also wrote the story of the first Australian sports team to tour overseas, which was an all-Aboriginal cricket team who played many games around Britain in 1868. Recent recognition of the grave of one of these cricketers who died in England, I'm not sure I can get this gentleman's name right, but I'll try. Yarraman. I'm terribly sorry, sir, but also known as King Cole, and you might have read that in the papers only a few months ago. They found where his remains were buried in Britain. He was the only one that didn't come home, and they've since commemorated it. And an Australian Indigenous cricket team of men and women were there for a bit of a ceremony when they commended him. Right, radiocarbon dating, there it is made easy. If you can, I pitched that off the web, but that might give you an idea. Relative dating is assigning dates to artefacts in sequence by comparisons with historical events, genealogies, tree rings and cultural changes, and we still use that to some extent, but the first absolute dating method, radiocarbon, comparing the ratios of types of carbon compounds left in organic material, was developed in the 1950s. Using very small samples of charcoal collected from sites where you can date bone and shell, which all contain carbon. Testing was initially very expensive, so Australian researchers could only afford to have a few samples dated. But now relative costs have come down and there are better techniques for processing smaller samples, so it's much less destructive. First carbon-14 date confirming that Aboriginal people had been in Australia since the Pleistocene, which is an epoch before the modern one, the Holocene, so longer ago than 10,000 years. It's important to archaeologists, probably means nothing to anybody else. But it came from central Queensland. It was John Mulvaney. He excavated in Kenneth Cave, recovered material left by Aboriginal people 16,000 years ago, and more recent material as well. In 1968, Mungo Lady and Mungo Man were found to be aged over 26,000 years before present, BP, which was later recently refined to 42,000 years. As the science improves, the techniques improve, they're re-looking at many of these dates, and Australian dates are going back further and further. But just confirmed what Aboriginal people have always known, and they were always here, but if they want to quote something scientific, it's there. Mulvaney also excavated the oldest dingo skeleton in Australia, which is about 3,500 years ago. There's more recent work pushed it back to about 3,700. And I apologise for putting cute dingo puppies there, but I hunted around online to see if I could find a picture of the Fronds Landing dingo skeleton for you. And I'm saddened to say there are many photographs of the skeletons of Mungo Man and Mungo Lady, their ancestral remains, and not one of the dingo. It shows us something about society, I suppose. Archaeological research contributes to history, but it's also political through its power of interpreting past cultures to the wider world, and has changed with social changes in Australia, contributing to 40,000 years becoming a catch cry when Aboriginal political activism gained momentum, with the 1963 Yolngu Bark petitions to the Commonwealth Parliament, the 1965 Freedom Rides seeking land rights and the protection of cultural significant sites. The Australian Institute of Aboriginal Studies, now Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, was set up in 1961 to record disappearing sites and dying languages, and Fred McCarthy was actually the first principal. The 1967 referendum gave the federal government power to make special laws for Indigenous people and included them in population counts. IAPSIS published the second Australia-wide map of Aboriginal territories in Australia in 1996 and an encyclopedia of Aboriginal Australia. The struggle for recognition, identity and control of their own culture by Indigenous people led to disagreements with archaeologists and a moratorium on the studies of ancestral remains. The Australian Archaeological Association, AAA, was formed in 1973 and the World Archaeological Congress in 1986, and led by Indigenous members, adopted a code of ethics in 1990, which the Australian Association amended and adopted in 1991, helped by Dave Johnston, who's sitting down the front here. It's a piece of history, living history. Practices, I think we could say, have improved considerably. There's better understanding of all sides of research. So on most campsites in Australia, the sand blows away, leaving artefacts and hard stones jumbled together. But inside caves and rock shelters, the soil builds up and protects the artefacts. Charcoal, shells and bone left there. Biddens and big shell mounds, of which those are some, protect cultural materials such as shells and stone artefacts. Excavations into cultural deposits are usually made in a trench, 1 metre wide and only 1 or a few metres long. Digging's hard work, painstakingly slow. Everything has to be sorted, weighed, and then analysis takes place in the laboratory. It can take many years before publishing. But it's only a keyhole. We're only looking at a small part of what the people who lived there left behind. Australian archaeologists look at a range of evidence to explain changes in site use, including environmental science. We save the cultural and environmental evidence, take samples to be dated, measure the different layers to tell whether people discarded a lot or a little at separate times, and which activities might have left this evidence. Studies of the manufacturing functions of stone tools through use wear and facets and scratches left on them, and analysis of microscopic plant and animal cells which stuck into the edges of these tools help us show how they were used. Comparing these results to the studies of past climates and sharing memories with traditional owners about getting bush tucker with their grandparents, it can reveal why people camp near some food resources at particular seasons or during different periods in the past. And studies of rock art show continuity and changes in culture. And archaeologists also study the many artefacts that have ended up in museums and private collections, sometimes helping the traditional owners to have these returned to their country by identifying where these items came from. Museums don't always have really good records, I have to say. It takes a bit of excavating to find them. So a lot of archaeological work is not digging, but walking over an area and studying the landscape, looking for stone tools, unusual mounds, rock art, scarred trees, any other clues left by the people in the past. Landscape archaeology always involves traditional owners from the planning stages through. Professor Isabel McBride developed Australian landscape archaeology, working in the 1960s with the Aboriginal people around New England and the northern coast of New South Wales, recording archaeological and cultural sites. Isabel always consulted with stakeholders prior to research and collaborated with traditional owners, developing strong, mutually beneficial relationships. And she summarised her research into illustrated booklets for the traditional owners, recognising their rights to information about their culture. Isabel's methods have shaped Australian archaeological studies, and her publications are not just academic, but show histories of the people in the past. And I actually learned as her research assistant, so that's what I'm doing for my own PhD research, is making illustrated booklets for the Watine people up at Weipa. There's a lot of archaeological research up there, and they're involved when we do it, but it doesn't filter back to them. It's published in scholarly journals, which I fall asleep reading, so you would too, probably. And like Tyndale, Isabel recognised that physical sites were part of a dynamic Aboriginal cultural system, and published evidence of the intricate trade in stone axes from southern Victoria all over eastern Australia, showing the sophisticated social and political relationships of Aboriginal exchange systems. Isabel also studied trade in lake-air grindstones and, together with linguist late Professor Louise Hercus, recorded many archaeological sites, languages and stories with traditional owners in Central Australia. A colleague of mine, Vlad Potesny, was a surveyor and he drew the most beautiful maps to accompany these records. They're very valuable to the descendants of some of the last fluent speakers of these languages. Isabel McBride and John Mulvaney worked on many committees for the protection of cultural heritage. Isabel working with traditional owners to ensure that the Mount William stone quarries, where the axe were traded from, on the National Heritage List for protection. She and John worked with the ANU and the Valiant Kampa and Pakenji people to return the remains of Mungo Lady and Mungo Man to their country, helped to make sure that Mudawinchi National Park was set up and the Willandra Lakes region achieved World Heritage status. I'm just putting all that in so you know that archaeology is just the tip. We do a whole lot of other stuff. Ethnography is the study of people and cultures through early records. Jinnabara and Kabi people remember that their old people held large gatherings every year in the Bunya Mountains when the bunya trees produced many huge nuts. Families and groups owned the trees, marked them and processed the abundant nuts to make cakes, feed other groups who travelled many kilometres to attend ceremonies and business. Some details of this festival recorded by Tom Petrie, whose daughter wrote up his memoirs later on. And these sorts of accounts can give a bit more detail. Aboriginal people will have passed down the old history from one to the other, generations. Sometimes there's a bit of detail in there that helps us interpret the archaeological record too. Ethnoarchaeology includes reviewing all this historical report and reporting the traditional ways still practiced by Aboriginal people. Dr. Josephine Flood there found very few stone tools in the Australian Alps, which suggested first of all that Aboriginal people weren't even there, and they avoided the high country. However, the ethnographic records show that large groups of Aboriginal people travelled from the coast every couple of years or every year and met up in the high country to feast on these bogong moths, which spend the summer clinging to a rock wall unless you light a smoky fire underneath and they all get stunned and fall off, and then you can singe them and eat them. So there was, as Josephine said, there was no ethnography, no moth hunters. She wrote a book called The Moth Hunters about this whole process of inviting people to your moth feast, preparing them and eating them. But without that ethnography, we would have said the people didn't go up to the mountains very often. So, Betty Meehan lived with the Adbara people of Island Land for several seasons in 1980, wrote Shellbed to Shell Midden, recording how coastal people moved seasonally, procured and cooked food and discarded the remnants. These are very useful models when we're looking at our own sites to tell us what might have happened there. Betty showed different types of Adbara camps were part of an integrated planned system, giving a full picture of Aboriginal use of the landscape. She still visits her Adbara family and they come down and visit her in Bungendore on days and nodding. Yes, this has all happened quite recently. Okay, states made laws to protect Indigenous heritage from the 1980s. Not the heritage in the 1980s, the laws in the 1980s. And studying the landscape through cultural heritage surveys became advisable to identify significant sites before development so these can be avoided, conserved or managed to prevent damage and being fined. This provided more work for archaeologists, anthropologists and historians outside of universities. Cultural heritage management grew rapidly and unevenly, with mining, town and suburban expansion, roads, railways and the many other types of development that damaged the ground surface. Archaeologists developed methods that increased the roles of traditional owners in these surveys. Identifying sites are important for their spirits, stories, ceremonies performed there, or reminders of where the old people used to live. Under Queensland's legislation, traditional owners have the boots on their foot and they can ask archaeologists and others to help with scientific studies. Today, the greatest amount of data on Aboriginal sites and landscapes comes from cultural heritage surveys, but much of the information remains the property of the client, the developer. Heritage protection is very difficult traditional ways of keeping and passing on knowledge, but in this mad world of development, it helps traditional owners to save significant sites. Archaeological projects in the universities rely on grants from the Australian Research Council and some other funding bodies, sometimes in partnerships with industry like mining companies. The projects are more likely to use excavation and to look at themes such as changes in the environment and cultures through time. Multidisciplinary studies involve the technical skills of historians, anthropologists, paleoecologists, geologists, geomorphologists and other environmental scientists. Many projects concentrate on a suite of sites or a region, but archaeologists also pose the big questions such as theories of when and from where people came to populate Australia. Research is now undertaken in partnership with Aboriginal groups. Tasmania became an island about 12,000 years ago, and when sea levels rose to make Bass Strait, the Torres Strait Islands formed about 8,000 years ago. Lake Carpentaria disappeared under a gulf. And did the early navigators come when the sea level was low, with less deep ocean crossings, or were they able to cross several or many times? Much of the evidence of this phase of settling is now under the sea, so there's a job for underwater archaeologists. Radiocarbon dating works well between several hundred and 50,000 years ago, which gives an end limit to how old a site can be if that's the only dating you're using. So we use many other methods of dating, including amino acid racemization, paleomagnetic signatures, thermoluminescence, I'm just impressing you with all the terms, optically stimulated luminescence, and many other comparisons of decaying elements such as potassium argon and uranium lead. We don't do it ourselves, we send it off to a lab and they do it for us, you'll be relieved to know, but there's a growing science field in there in dating the past. Archaeologists sometimes apply several methods on different materials to get longer time periods and to cross-check the results. Recently, archaeologists have confirmed that Aboriginal people have been living in northern Australia for at least 65,000 years, and they were using a full range of sophisticated stone tools, including the earliest ground-edged stone tools anywhere in the world and the oldest seed grinding stones outside of Africa. So if anyone says Australian archaeology is boring, how could it be? Okay, physical anthropology is a part of archaeology. It's the study of humans in the past, using measurements, biochemistry and functional studies. The hot research now, of course, is on DNA, with methods that can trace family links back to when they split from each other. Aboriginal people show the longest intact genealogies in the world, sharing some genes with other very early human populations emerging from Africa and diverging from Eurasians about 51 to 72,000 years ago. Archaeologists help to identify the ancestral remains in institutions. Remember I said Fred McCarthy helped to steal them. These remains are around the world and they help to bring them home. One of my colleagues is working with the people of Oampelli to locate and repatriate the ancestral remains that Fred helped to steal, and they're in the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, but there's a process running as we speak to identify them and bring them home. And archaeologist Lila Hagland, who's sitting down the front here, set a very high standard for accuracy and sensitivity when reburying ancestral remains. Commissioned by the Queensland Government to remove the ancestors' graves in an Aboriginal burial ground at Broadbeach on the Gold Coast, she had no choice in the outcome, but her methodology of recording in detail the position, orientation and components of all burials enabled reburial in exactly the same pattern in a nearby site. The 50th anniversary celebration at the Broadbeach reburial site with the traditional owners in 2015 was a very beautiful and proud event. And the book still inspires Aboriginal groups in their repatriation programs, including the Ghana people that I worked with in Adelaide. And there's Lila and Helen sitting down the front. You can actually look at them and touch them at morning tea. A piece of history. Or no, not a Sami. Lila's dad was a pastor, wasn't he, working up in that area. So there she is in her white costume on the skis. Many years ago. So the evolution of Australian archaeology continues as new, less invasive scientific techniques, and they can wring more information out of less archaeological evidence with less disturbance of cultural material. The chemical constituents of rock art paints and rocks can now be analysed in the field with a handheld spectroscopy. You don't have to chop a bit off and take it back to a lab anymore. Global positioning systems, GPS, use satellites, lasers in total stations, low-level flying in aircraft, and now drones are affordable, so that's changing the face of landscape archaeology. Just zip that you don't have to climb up the big cliff anymore, you can send the drone up. So we use physics and geomorphology and a whole lot of other scientific stuff. So if you don't want to go plodding around in the dirt, you can still help archaeology by going into the science area, what Time Team calls geophys. Now, when you get a map out of a GPS machine like that, it's very difficult to read. It's just supposed to show patches of air and disturbances in the ground, but you need an expert and it takes quite a while to actually interpret it, so that's where some of your cost comes in. But the method is improving amazingly. The request of traditional owners at Marpoon, it's up on Cape York, near where I'm working, my colleagues have identified traditional and coffin burials in mounds near the old mission site, and there's no disturbance through doing that, just using this one. To confirm it, you would have to excavate, but if the traditionals don't want to do that, it's not necessary. And underwater archaeology using sonar from a boat is helping us too. So Australian archaeologists are learning from their past practices, and they keep striving to improve the methods of working with traditional owners and encouraging respect for our shared history. Ironically, Aboriginal custodians have always had some control on field research by just not telling you where something is. So working with them now, with the descendants, can show so much more about the past. And it's now done with respect, and we share in the information. There's more ownership and involvement of custodians in projects, and the formation of the Indigenous Archaeological Association in 2004. Dave's going to tell us a bit more about that. Methods of presenting research of the past are changing. Films are being made, websites designed with public and restricted areas, and all methods of digital media, which you fellas will all be into, but I'm a bit late for that, but there's a big future in promoting information in the future. It's a very flexible field. Theories and explanations change as you get more evidence, and new methods come along. Society changes and views of the past are revised. It's contributed to reconciliation by confirming that Aboriginal people have owned their land for at least 65,000 years, and emphasising how sophisticated Aboriginal societies were and still are. They used resources in sustainable ways, which is a very environmental thought these days. Reconciliation has removed archaeology from purely scientific explanations to seeing the land and people together and adding cultural knowledge to land management, with the benefits of a culture passed through intricate stories, theatre and dances that have been handed down by the ancestors and passed on for many, many generations, setting the laws and guiding lifestyles. So I hope I haven't bored you completely. Thank you for your attention, and my email's there if you'd like to know more, but I'm here today and happy to talk to you. We'll have Dave talking now, and there'll be time to ask questions of both of us after Dave's done his thing.